Hello, my name is David Baxter. I'm the Senior PPP Advisor to the International Sustainable Resilience Center located in the United States, and also Steering Committee member of the World Association of Public-Private Partnerships. Recently, I wrote a 10-point article on how public-private partnerships can be used for national recovery. The focus in this article was on the United States, but it can be applied to other countries as well. In the post-pandemic era that we're living in, we are facing a number of situations where public-private partnerships have the opportunity to help countries achieve the economic goals quicker and also to reset their objectives and reset the approach that they have in working with the private sector to help national recovery. This would specifically, I think, apply to the private sector, involvement in infrastructure development, but this is also not just limited to infrastructure. It could also play a role in critically important social services such as healthcare as countries move towards recovery. The 10 points that I listed included the following, and I'll go through them briefly. The first one is there needs to be a strengthening of national PPP advisory units. In many cases, countries don't have them, or they do exist at a federal level like you have in the United States. And this is critically important that these units are strengthened, given the resources that they need, and also work closely with the government to create the legal framework or the enabling environment so that PPPs can be implemented more successfully. It wouldn't harm countries as well to look at creating a national PPP advisory steering committee, a national body consisting of ministries, the private sector as well, that can help a country refine its approach to PPPs and help a country also decide what its priorities are. Especially this would help at subnational level when you get to different states like in the United States, but this would also be applicable to a country like Nigeria, which is a federal state, or Malaysia, which is essentially a federal state, where you have very powerful state governments that have their own priorities, their own needs, and in many instances they're not talking to one another or they compete with one another, and this is not a strategy or an approach for success. So what is important is a PPP unit, a national PPP unit, an advisory committee to work together to identify short-term, medium-term, and long-term strategies for economic recovery. Short-term are the immediate, and everyone has been terribly focused on the short-term since the event of the pandemic. But we have to start thinking post-pandemic now and start looking at what I would call the medium-term projects as well as the long-term. And the long-term basically needs or involves people who are focused on a national strategy. What is important to note also is that short-term events or short-term lessons that have been learned or short-term projects can form the basis for medium and long-term projects as well. So we can't forget this. Not every country can do every project. And I wrote an article recently where I looked at the triage system, which is applied in the medical profession, to look at how you can decide which projects can be saved and which projects should move forward. All over the world, countries are looking at now reprioritizing their PPP pipelines and their priorities because of the impacts of the pandemic, whether it is on trade, their economy, or on the people. And so it's important that as countries move forward, they need to reprioritize, revisit their pipelines, and decide which projects can be saved to move forward, which projects are beyond repair and should be dropped, which projects can survive on their own and don't need help. And in that way, this will help countries move forward carefully with the limited resources they have. It's also important that all state as well as national priorities and projects are coordinated, especially in the situation of countries where there are large provincial governments or large metropolitan areas or federal states. Often these projects overlap with multiple jurisdictions, especially when you think of linear projects like power grids or roads or railways. And there's always a struggle and almost a conflict between the different parties when they try and look at how they can implement projects across jurisdictional lines. And this creates opportunities for the private sector, which often is not tied to a specific state government, to help move the process forward, to sort of massage the egos that can be involved and the conflicting jurisdictional responsibilities. It's also important for the private sector that PPP procurement documents and best practices and approaches are standardized. If they are not standardized, it gets very confusing for the private sector to pursue PPP projects. And this is particularly relevant in the United States, where every state seems to operate as a separate country, and this is not a good idea. Often people say to me, it must be great to work on PPPs in the United States, and what are the great ideas that the country is coming with? And I have to remind them that working in the United States is like working in 50 different countries. And so it's not ideal, but I repeat again that we have to standardize the process. What happens in, for example, Florida when it comes to implementing a PPP should be no different to what happens in California or in Virginia or Maryland. You don't want to be in this situation where countries constantly have, or not countries, but where private sector participants or potential partners have to relearn the game and relearn the strategies and relearn the rules and relearn the whole approach while they're in the same country. One of the tests that the private sector constantly looks at also is the whole idea of, do we really have a chance when we pursue a certain tender? Bidders are very concerned about whether they are truly competitive and whether the procurement process is transparent. If there are queries about this, then you have a problem, and it will turn off serious bidders for projects. So every country and every institution that's involved with PPPs and procuring them should absolutely ensure that they move forward with a transparent approach. By that we mean information available to everyone. Competitive, what we mean by that no one party is inadvertently or on purpose given information that gives them an advantage over the other. Because when this happens, you will find that many of the private sector parties or companies might never bid again on your projects. The pandemic has also taught us that we need to implement what I would say People First PPPs. This is an initiative that's being led by the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, based in Geneva. Where they're looking at is not just looking at value for money for PPP projects, but they are also looking at how you can put people or concerns about people back into projects. So this includes ideas such as people first, as well as value for people, value for money, and value for the future. And this is for the future of people, but also for the future of the infrastructure. So what we're talking about is finding ways to consider future-proofing of projects. Future-proofing is incredibly important in PPPs. PPPs are 20, 30, 40 years in duration, and we never know how long or what can happen in these very long projects. And so it's important that countries think in the long term when it comes to PPPs, and also try and prepare for the unexpected. It's always a possibility that things could happen which we don't expect. If you just think of the pandemic that we had, no one expected it. PPP projects all over the world got into trouble, and people started trying to blame one another. Well, no one was really to blame because no one created the pandemic, but the blame can lie at people or at the government or contracts that were set up that did not have provisions or strategies to help mitigate the risks caused by these major pandemics. And as a result, risk management, which is an integral part of PPPs, was kind of left to, well, let's see what happens, or it's never going to happen. Much can be done. I think good leadership, innovation, and strong partnerships between the public and private sector will always help. What's happening in Poland, what's happening in the United States, and what's happening in emerging economies is not unique. It's happening everywhere. So I wish you good luck with your conference and have a great day. Thank you.